to our seminar and our webinar, in this case, Shelter Services in Mexico's Aerospace Industry. A very important topic, a very important concept that is going to hopefully bring together many ideas that were discussed in the past days in different conversations and webinars. I'm gonna quickly go through the dynamics of this webinar. We are going to have introductions of the panelists. We have three very important panelists today. They are going to have a time slot to speak about their companies and their services they offer. Later, we are going to have ample time to discuss questions and answers. So at this time, I am going to open the opportunity to our panelists. We are going to start with Mr. Joshua Rubin, Vice President of Business Development of JBIT Mexico. And I will give him the time to speak about his company, JBIT.
Thank you, Aldo. Yes, my name is Joshua Rubin. I am the Vice President of Business Development here at JBIT de Mexico, JBIT LLC. We've been around since 1983 and have over 25 customers here servicing in 27 different facilities. Currently, we have over 3,500 employees in Sonora, Mexico, and able to service you in anywhere that you might need service for. We service currently industries that are in promotional products, aerospace, automotive, construction, medical, you name it, we probably have a customer that does something similar to it. Aldo, I appreciate the time and reaching out to me to be part of this experience and this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Next, we are going to introduce Angel Quintero. He's the General Director of DIMSA. And at this point, I'm gonna open an opportunity for him to speak about his company. If you're ready, Angel, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Aldo. Thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you Mexico Now for inviting us to this important seminar. My name is Angel Quintero, Business Development Manager at DIMSA. DIMSA is a Mexican service provider specialized in shelter and management outsourcing support to companies establishing operations in Mexico. We currently have over 25 years of experience operating and successfully soft landing operations in Mexico. Also, we currently have around 135 active customers running around 14,000 payroll for our customers every week. We currently have operations all nationwide, particularly on the NAFTA corridor, going from Querétaro to Monterrey. And well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope this is of great interest of everyone.
Thank you, Angel. You are going to definitely extend your points of view in a few minutes during the question and answer session. Next, in our order of appearance, we have Salomón Noble, CEO of Intermex. A very interesting introduction is coming up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Aldo. Hello, everyone. My name is Salomón Noble. And to start on a positive note, next year we will be celebrating Intermex's 50th birthday, and hopefully together with the end of this pandemic. Intermex has been facilitating the successful establishment and operation of international companies throughout the Mexican Republic. For these last 50 years, we have helped more than 200 companies, and we have in excess of 7,000 employees in our different shelter services that we have in our operations today. Our business model basically includes two strategic business units. We have, of course, the shelter services, and we have as well the industrial real estate, where we provide the building for our tenants as well, constituting a one-stop shop modality. Thank you, Aldo, and looking forward to talking to you and my colleagues as well. Thank you, Mexico Now.
Thank you, Salomón. Thank you. Now, we are going to start going to the core or the most important part of this time for the webinar, which is the Q&A session. But first, we have a brief message for you.
Are you looking to expand your manufacturing business globally while improving your bottom line? Mexico is your answer. Intermex, your partner. Intermex is one of Mexico's most important manufacturing management support and industrial real estate providers. Our customer portfolio of more than 200 international manufacturing firms benefit from effective establishment, operation, and continued success. Additionally, we present our clients with the opportunity to further reduce costs and optimize operation performance by utilizing different management strategies such as shelter, startup, Mexican entity management, specialized services, and our multi-tenant and shared facility option. If Mexico is your choice of destination, Intermex will provide you with highly competitive advantages for the support and experience that can enable your venture to succeed. Think Mexico. Think Intermex.
That was great, very important introductions. Now let's get to the heart and to the core of this opportunity. And without spending any extra time, I'm going to invite Joshua, Angel, and Salomon to join me on the screen. We are going to get straight to the questions and answers portion of the webinar. So I'm gonna start. First things first. Shelter. Concept, definition, semantics, misconceptions, maybe, or different ways of thinking about the same concept with different language. So, Angel, tell us about shelter. How does the shelter program work?
Sure, Aldo. Well, first of all, I apologize. I had a little bit of connection trouble at the beginning, so my introduction was not there. I'll take the time at the end to introduce a little bit more about myself. But going into topic, how does the shelter program works? Let's start with the basic definition. Shelter is a program that allows you to import on temporary basis or in consignment raw materials and machinery, allowing you to manufacture in Mexico and export goods, either virtually or physically. I think it is also important to talk a little bit about the history of shelter, as you mentioned, to understand where it is coming from and also understand a little bit of where it's going to. So shelter was created over 40 years ago. It has been having a lot of changes and evolutions through all these years. First of all, back in the day, it was created mostly based on the fear of American companies unsure about the legal framework in Mexico. So these shelter provider came up and were born, supporting and giving these companies the peace of mind that they needed to operate in Mexico. Afterwards and along the years, it also became an important tax advantage for companies that were operating with an IMEX program in Mexico. We can talk about that actually a little bit further on the panel. And nowadays, it has been changing a lot, and it has more relation with the strategy of the foreign companies of knowing whether or not they want to have a legal presence in Mexico, other than any other type of benefits. It has, settled to a point of more and a strategical decision rather than a financial decision.
Thank you, Angel. That was very important definition to set the scene and start talking about more details. Now, I'm gonna take this next question to Salomon. In your point of view, Salomon, what are the three main advantages of operating under a shelter scheme?
Thank you, Aldo. Well, the main advantages, I will define the categories and then develop a little bit in each one of them. And I will start with strategic advantages. I will continue with economic advantages, and I will end with operation advantages. From the perspective of the strategic advantages, the shelter will allow the strategic sourcing customer to focus on what they do best and leave the rest, which is all the red tape and all the compliance aspects of operating in a different country with different laws, language, and regulations, to the shelter provider. So it will allow the management to focus on their manufacturing and the success of the operation. The second strategic advantage is no risk nor exposure to any unknown compliance environment, which will create these sourcing in Mexico for companies that have never been here in the country in a one-stop shop approach. From the economic perspective, the main advantage, clearly the reason many companies are sourcing in Mexico, is the lower total cost of operation throughout the shelter concept. And this happens not through black magic, but it happens through economies of scale. Basically, the shelter has a platform of operations where you will receive a fraction of the cost of the different key functions of the shelter, like human resources, payroll, import and export, international commerce, etc. You will receive a fraction of that cost and not the full impact as if you were trying to do it on your own. So economies of scale is the magic there. And from the operation, I would mention three fundamental advantages. The first one will be the rapid deployment. The time to market to have the operation in place will be about 9 weeks. Provided the building is in place or is an available building, you can be operating in 9 weeks. Number two is the learning curve aspect, that you can bypass all the pain and the costly mistakes made throughout the learning curve by taking advantage of the shelter operations. It's not that the shelter operators are particularly smart or wise. The fact is that all the mistakes that there are, we already made them for you. So we know where are the pitfalls and we will avoid them for you. It's a concept of not only the know-how, but as well the know-who. In Mexico, very important, the know-who is a component that is addressed as well by the shelter, because we know all the mechanics and the key people to get the things done. And lastly is the synergy of operating through the shelter customer ecosystem. In other words, your operation may be related to another one of the shelter company, and through the shelter operator, you can establish a relationship and maybe buy or sell products to these other companies and make your establishment more successful. Thank you. I hope I explained the advantages of the shelter.
Absolutely. Thank you, Salomon. I like your remark about know-how and know-who. It's so critical and many times not recognized on time. So thank you for that. There is another, I'm sure, important question that many of the audience thinking about. For you, Joshua, is there any type of out of bounds or limits? In other words, what products or families of products can be manufactured or assembled under the shelter program?
No, thank you, Aldo. No, that's definitely a good question, and a question that I get asked pretty frequently. And I would think my my partners here below me or around me in the shelter industry get asked this all the time. In short, it's pretty much anything could be manufactured in Mexico. Now, there are limitations to certain products that might fall under the ITAR. Weapons, ammunition are prohibited in Mexico, but that's where us shelter companies can definitely help you in making sure we understand the details of what products are being made. There are restrictions in Mexico to certain types of products, and it just means that you have to comply with what the restrictions might be. Like, for example, with metals and textiles, and other products might be, Mexico might have some limitations, or the US might have limitations on them. And we just work with our clients to be able to work around those limitations and get the permits that might be needed for those products. Another question that actually stems from your question is where do you actually manufacture the product also? So once you've determined, hey, I want to do this product, is where's the best place to do it? In Mexico, you can manufacture anywhere. The problem is, are you willing to invest the time, the money, the resources to be able to prepare a small little town to be able to produce what you want? Or you can come with a shelter provider that will be able to set you up in the right location, that if you're going to be focusing in aerospace, that you might want to pick the right state, the right location that will help you in that area. Same thing, that there's certain cities that are more prone to textiles, certain cities that are more prone to automotive, that we might want to help you in locating the best spot to actually put that product in. And then in question to the aerospace industry, since that's what this call is roughly about, the aerospace industry is one of the largest in Mexico. In 2002, there was over 300 aerospace companies in Mexico manufacturing products. And it started back in 1970 is actually when we started seeing the first aerospace companies come around. There's names that Rockwell Collins, Honeywell, Bombardier, Lear, and Gulfstream that are all manufacturing products here in Mexico. So it's definitely something that's doable. So in short, anything could be manufactured in Mexico. There are some things that are very limited, prohibited, like I said, weapons and ammunition. But overall, we can work with any products that need to be made. I hope that answers your question, Aldo.
Of course. Yeah, what I read, what I take away from here is there is no limit. There is no technically no limit for the characteristic, or the size, or the volume, or the industry. Very across the board concept. So the shelters can definitely help any opportunity. There is no such a limit for small or big, or any type of particular commodity. So that's important to mention. So Angel, if you would give us your point of view on this next question, are there any variations to the shelter program? Are there any special suited programs or combinations, such as for startups or any other type of opportunity under the shelter concept?
Sure. I'm going to take a little bit of time for this question because actually it's a very interesting one. You know, as you may all be well aware nowadays, Mexico is not a stranger to foreign investment. Therefore, many alternatives have been developed over the years depending on the business needs and strategies. However, I would like to narrow it down to the three main alternatives to have a manufacturing operation in Mexico per se. One of them is to operate under a master shelter. The other one is to operate under an individual shelter. And the other one is to, incorporate a subsidiary in Mexico itself. First of all, I would like to start by saying that there is not right or wrong alternative. All of them are viable. All of them are good. All depends on the business need, the strategy, and most importantly, the timing. This is an important matter to take into consideration by going to these alternatives. If I may, I would like to speak a little bit about each one of these alternatives. So beginning with the master shelter. Master shelter, it's a type of Mexican entity managed by a shelter provider already existing that hosts several companies under the same entity, sharing permits and registrations already. This has a great advantage actually because of the timing. If one of the constraints for the business is timing, you can relatively fast, be enrolled on this entity and operate as soon as possible once your business is ready to operate. On the downside, however, it's that it has a higher risk since you are sharing permits and registration with other companies. If one of them makes a mistake, and for example, the IMEX program or any other important permit gets compromised there, your operation may be affected without, you being responsible of it. Also, another disadvantage is a little bit of time on the terms of independence. If you want to eventually become independent, all the process of establishing a new operation, well, you have to go through all that process. So it might take longer at the time for you to become independent. And let's face it, there are some cases in which the service provider and the delivery by the service provider is not necessarily the best, or does not matches the company expectations, the foreign company expectations. So if you want to, become independent and finish the relation with this master shelter service provider, it might get complicated. So this is pretty much, again, it's a term of the master shelter. Now, speaking about the individual shelter, it's pretty much, again, a shelter service provider incorporates an individual entity with individual permits and registrations for you. The main advantage of this, different from the master shelter, is that you are not you are not liable for the performance of any other company or for any other customer of your provider. Also, if you want to become independent along the time, it is relatively easy to do so. All that you have to do, or all that has to be done, is basically transfer the already existing company with the already existing permits and registrations from the provider's ownership to the parent company's ownership. So it's relatively faster. Now, the disadvantage that it's also fair to say, it's the timing. Incorporate the entity and obtaining the permits and registrations required to successfully operate in Mexico. And of course, taking advantage of the shelter program itself, it takes longer. It might take a few months actually to be able to, take the advantage of the IMEX certification and the VAT certification. So if your constraint is not a timing, you still have enough time, to set up your operation. An individual shelter might be the most convenient alternative. And also, well, one of the, as the textbook says, one of the main advantages of being in either one of the two shelter models is that you will not have a legal presence in Mexico. Therefore, your liability is reduced considerably, being held by the shelter service provider. And the last option, but not the least, is establishing your own subsidiary in Mexico. In terms of timing, it's pretty much the same as incorporating an individual shelter. It might take longer. Of course, also you have the downside of the liabilities and being held liable for any responsibility in Mexico, either on labor, international trade, environmental health and safety, etc. So that's also to be taken into consideration. However, on terms of, and of course, I will not go very deep into this part, but in terms of taxes and taxing, it is actually more competitive to incorporate your own entity from day one rather than operating on an individual or master shelter. And also, the same case, if you want to become independent, it is relatively easier and faster because you are already independent. So you are only talking about a contract of administrative support services with a service provider, and if you just need to terminate the relation, you don't just have to do the appropriate negotiations on that and be free. So these are mainly the three alternatives. I hope this answered the question.
I see, and I take away huge concept here is flexibility. So there, in other words, there is no such a very solid or written on stone kind of approach. It's very flexible and very adaptable to the needs of the clients. So thank you, Angel. There's another question here with similar ideas, but more specifically about space. Joshua, this one is for you. How is the manufacturing space provided by the shelter operator? Is it share space? Is it possible to share space, or is it always an independent facility? Can you walk us through, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. This question really is more up to the client and what the client needs in the specifications of the client. Like Salomon was mentioning, there are shelters that actually own industrial buildings as well, and they can actually service the client by providing them buildings already built for them or built to suit. There's other shelters that do not own buildings or own land. So what they do is that they'll find buildings from landlords in the city and either rent them for the specifications of the customer. Either it be individually, be multi-tenant. You can find many different options when it comes into buildings. Some of the other options are, it all depends on what you're trying to find, whether you're trying to find cost savings or what type of benefits. You can find buildings that are standalone 100% for just an individual client that can go from 10,000 square feet all the way up to 800 plus thousand square feet. Or you can get a 200,000 square foot building and subdivide it into different sections and put multiple clients with a wall that separates them. Or you can have one building with multiple clients, because it's kind of like what Angel was saying, that it's underneath the same legal entity. You can have multiple clients in the same building in a shared space. It really comes down into what the needs are of the client. Some of the experiences that we have had is if it's going to be an incubator, would be the term that we use. For someone that's just starting off, they need a space very small, maybe 1,000, 2,000 square feet, just for maybe 10, 15 employees, and then they're going to grow and escalate themselves into a bigger operation. There's definitely shelter providers that can provide that type of framework for those companies. They'll rent a space really small, put them in a warehouse right next to the shelter provider, and as they grow, they phase them in. Or as landlords, different landlords, what they can do also is phase them into a bigger building as well. Start off, say they want 100,000 in 2 years, the landlord will phase them into a 20,000, and they'll grow little by little into that space. So it really depends on what it is that the client needs and how they're looking to be able to manufacture their product and what their scale is in the next coming years, so that we can service them the best way. But an answer is yes, you can have multi-tenant buildings, you can have individual buildings, you can have a building that is subdivided into many different types. Most shelter providers are going to be able to provide the needs of the customer, or at least find a way to provide them the needs that they need.
Again, flexibility is the name of the game here. There is the option to scale up, and I can attest by myself. I've been in different opportunities through my career to work with shelter schemes, and I can confirm that it's very flexible, it's very user-friendly, business-friendly to scale up space, and that should not be a concern. That should not be a showstopper or any type of interference in decision-making for clients. We have one more question for Salomon, and this is going straight to the P&L, of course, of everybody is always considering that as most important. It's a complex question, but I'm sure you have a solid answer. Salomon, how much does it cost to operate under the shelter program? Walk us through the cost structure. How is it configured?
Okay, let me try to answer that. That is indeed a complex question. So it's a composite question. You're talking about the cost structure, and you want to know how much does it cost. So let me try to answer first the perspective of the cost structure, and then address the cost of typical operations. So the shelter, a shelter typically is organized as an unrelated cost center of the parent company, because typically the shelter company is not related to the parent company sourcing in Mexico, and basically the relationship between these two is a contractual one. So we're going to put the unrelated cost center in the shelter company. The parent company is not related to it. They're going to have a relationship that I'm going to describe now. Well, this operation is going to have expenses, clearly a number of expenses that we're going to discuss. And all of these expenses are going to be passed through. This concept of pass-through expenses, the shelter entity, which belongs to the shelter company, is going to expense items as the parent company instructs them to do, and they will pass through those costs to the parent company. So the concept of the pass-through is key, and those pass-throughs will come in the form of an invoice in a periodic basis, weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, depending on your arrangement with the shelter company. As well, you can expect to have an itemized file transfer protocol, FTP, configured. So the parent company ERP, your systems, can be electronically fed by the actual costs and transactions already configured to the accounting catalog that each company has. They will be already classified, and through a file transfer can be feeding the ERP directly without any data entry for those costs. Now the invoice elements, and I'm going to address them in a Pareto approach. So we talk about the largest items that constitute the largest component of the few items that constitute the large amount, 80% at least of the invoice, are going to be the following concepts. The first one is the labor, and the labor related. Labor being clearly the payroll, which happens monthly, which happens typically weekly, on a weekly basis or bi-weekly, which is passed through to the customer, and all the related expenses in Mexico. And this is all the red tape that exists around the payroll. Just trying to master this is a challenge for any company, and basically is one of those that has negative value. If you do it perfectly, it has zero value. But if you do it wrong, it has a lot of consequences in terms of fines and trouble with the authorities, because it's related with the medical, the social security, the bonuses, the vacations, and all the relationship with the social security here in Mexico, which can be very complicated. So that's the largest part of your invoice is going to be about labor and labor-related expenses, pass-through basis. The second one is going to be the CapEx and the OpEx. CapEx is the capital expenditures that you may require to operate here in Mexico, and the operating expenses, such as those like the utilities, the insurance, your MRO, etc. The freight and freight-related component as well, that depends on the number of shipments that you have, both inbound and northbound or outbound, the custom brokerage, the import and export fees, etc. You're going to see all those reflected there. The rent of the building and the rent related, typically rents here in Mexico are triple net. So you're going to be responsible or in a pass-through basis for the insurance, the property tax, and the non-structural maintenance of the facility. So all those will be as well passed through to you. And finally is a shelter fee. For all these services, you're going to get a fee from your shelter provider. So all that will come to you as in the form of an invoice and on a pass-through basis on a periodic invoicing mode. So that addresses the structure of the relationship and the structure of the cost center of the shelter. Now, how much does it cost? So one thing as a tip, one thing that most shelter operators will prepare for you, a pro forma cost model. It's a cost analysis. Once you populate a questionnaire with the shelter provider, which basically addresses the labor structure, how many operators you're going to have, the type of operator, supervisors, etc. You create your manpower capability. You define the shifts that you're going to work. You define as well how many shipments per month, per week, per day are you going to have, and we calculate the utilities for you. Then a cost model is assembled, and you can pro forma it. And over time, you can see on the first year, which is the ramp up mode, and once it's stabilized, how much it's going to cost to you. So that's a tip, and you should be getting that. A word of caution: be very careful in the process, as labor is the most important component of any of these cost centers. Define carefully each one of the job descriptions, so the shelter here in Mexico can tropicalize your job description in the US and make sure that the job description in Mexico corresponds exactly to what you're looking for. So the recruitment and selection process is done accordingly to your requirement. So let me give you two examples to address how much does it cost. And I have prepared here for you a labor-intensive assembly type of operation. Let's say it's a wiring harness operation with 300 people working in 2 shifts with 50 inbound and 50 outbound shipments per month. You can expect ranges of cost from $7 to $9 all in. This is the wrap rate cost per hour. This $7 to $9 includes everything: the labor, the rent, the CapEx, the OpEx, typically for the wiring harness operation. So you can relate to that. That's the total landed cost, $7 to $9. per hour, per clock hour, very important. It's not realized hour with efficiency, it's just a clock hour, the payroll hour. Relate that to, let's say, between 12 and 15 bucks per hour for just the labor for some operator in the US with the minimum wage. So this is $7 to $9 all in. So that's the power of a shelter operation here in Mexico. Now for a more sophisticated operation that does fabrication, let's talk about a machining operation with computer numerically controlled machines, CNCs. Let's talk about an 80 people operation in 2 shifts. You can expect ranges from 12 to 15 bucks an hour. Again, all in, wrap rate, clock hour. So relate that to the cost of a machinist in the US versus the 12 to 15 all in cost per clock hour. So I hope I planted a seed of curiosity. Talk to your shelter provider where it makes sense, and we will assemble for you this cost model, and you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised of the competitive advantages from the economic perspective that the shelter can give you, along the other competitive advantages that you can gain by nearshoring here in Mexico. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Salomon. That is very, very important. And of course, the audience here, feel free to keep going and asking questions through the platform. I see more coming. And definitely there will be the need for one-to-one connections after the seminar. We are going to make sure everybody knows the contact information of Joshua, Angel, and Salomon to get together, arrange meetings, and engage and talk about the details. So what you exposed in the last minutes, Salomon, is critical and definitely a key element in the whole concept. So that takes us to the next question for Joshua. I'm sure somebody will be asking or wanting to ask, how does a shelter company reach such economies of scale? How do you make it? How can you make this magic realize? Is the shelter really less expensive to operate than a standalone operation? Tell us about that.
Man, you give me the hard questions, don't you? No, not really. I'm going to have to break this down a little bit because overall, the shelter is always going to be the best option cost-wise. Salomon was explaining kind of the cost per hour in that structure, and that just right there gives you the feeling as to why the shelter is always going to be beneficial. Whether you're 1 to 10 employees or in the thousands of employees, the shelter is always going to be able to provide you a service that's going to be cheaper than doing it on your own. Now, how is the question? That's where the scale of economies and all that comes in. Shelter operators, and I'm going to break this down into different areas. First one would be in the area of say, vendors and your expenses that you do here in Mexico. The shelter operator isn't a company of 100 employees or 200 employees. The shelter operator is a company of multiple employees. So when we're negotiating, let's say a cafeteria, transportation, some kind of expenses that need to be made in Mexico for the operation, we're representing 3,000, 4,000, 12,000 employees company. So when we're negotiating with these vendors, you're not negotiating over thousands of dollars in profit that these companies are making. You're negotiating over possibly millions of dollars that the vendors could be making when they do business with Javid, or when they do business with Intermex or Beamstyle or whatever other shelter provider. So that's the benefit that we have, is that when it comes to vendors and your expenses, is that you're talking about a company that is a lot larger than the one single operation company. So when we're negotiating, we're definitely going to be able to get lower prices for our clients. The other one comes into the governments, and I'm going to talk very briefly about the coronavirus and how the shelters have really played a big part in the coronavirus issue. It's the same concept as the vendors. We're not a company of 100 people going to the state or federal government asking them for help, or asking them to pitch in money to support this company, or to invest money in these areas in the roads for the transportation companies. We're a company of 3, 4, 5, 10+ thousand employees. So that when we go and ask, we're a company that brings employment to the country. We're a company that is bringing investment to the country, that we're able to have a little bit more push and pull with the government to tell them, hey, we need you to do this. So we definitely have the support. And a good example is during the coronavirus, the shelter providers were very hands-on inside with the government, saying why the companies should be open, why the manufacturing industry should remain open and not close them down, expressing the impact of what could happen to the industry if shutdowns. And that's actually what really helped and pushed the economy for the manufacturing industry to remain open and continue to remain open even throughout the rest of the times. We're able to demonstrate that, hey, yeah, I have 27 plus facilities, and all my facilities, we aren't spreading, the spread of the virus isn't spreading into our facilities because we have hand sanitizer, we're taking temperatures, we have protocols that are very clearly established. So that's another really good example as to how a shelter company is able to spread the scale of economies. The other one would be in software. You have a shelter company that has purchased and invested a lot of money into ensuring that the software that we use to be able to ensure compliance and tax regulations, payroll, human resources, accounting, environmental health and safety, customs. We've invested a lot of money to where a company of say 200-300 employees wouldn't be able to afford it, or it would just be way out there. A lot of the softwares also for shelter companies are difficult to just have any regular software provider make one that is a shelter company software. So you have a lot of shelter companies that actually invest the money to build and create their own software systems that are actually adequate for what we need to provide. So that's the other benefit that you have, is that you won't find that in any other company. You won't find that in a standalone operation. And the same thing, the investment that us shelters put in our softwares is for all our clients. It isn't for one client. It is for everybody. So that cost that we invested is diluted when you're spreading it out through multiple operations. Now that goes into my next point, is cost. There's a lot of cost involved in making sure that your company's compliant in any country, whether it be the United States, whether it be Mexico. Salomon was mentioning this in his topics earlier in the webinar, was we have all the staff needed to be able to ensure compliance in the administrative side of the company. Now, digging deeper to that, we invest our money to ensure that we have the most knowledgeable and most intelligent people working in our accounting departments. We have a payroll specialist, we have tax specialists, we have vendor relations, we have accounts payable, accounts receivable. In our HR, we have different layers of HR. We have level 1s, level 2s, 3s, 4s, managers, directors. We invest our money to make sure that we have the staff that is needed to ensure that a multi-functional company is successful, so that we are ensuring that we're compliant in the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 range employees, where a company of 200 might not invest money in having anything other than maybe an accounting manager and maybe a clerk. We actually have departments that are 10, 15, 20 people departments to ensure that our customers are being protected and that are being compliant in the laws that are required. So with that, it is, and I can go into detail, that we have CPAs, accountants, we have specialists in Annex 24 and Annex 31, which is the customs regulations. We have import and export specialists. Some shelter providers have in-house brokers that can do the classification of your products. So there's a lot of investment that we put into ensuring that our office, our sheltered office, can provide the services that a company will need. Now, going back into it, that is where you can see large investment for the smaller size companies. For when you start getting into the companies that are 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 employees, most of the time you think, oh, they don't need a shelter provider. They don't want a shelter provider because they're the large. The reasons why you might choose a shelter or go standalone is really an internal decision. A company of 2,000, 3,000, a Lear, a Rockwell Collins might still use a shelter for different reasons. Maybe they don't want a legal presence, kind of like what Angel was talking about earlier. They don't want a legal presence. Why? They don't want something tied to their U.S. corporation that could affect them over there. So there's those limitations as well. But for the bigger companies, what we kind of morph into is more of an advisory service provider. We advise them and ensure that they're compliant in their area. Shelter providers also have the ability to offer our services into an a la carte kind of service. If you're a bigger corporation and you want to be independent in a standalone operation, the shelter company can provide you just the recruiting, just the tax submissions, just the accounting. So there are those benefits that shelters are able to provide you. And now going into the second phrase, which I kind of already answered, was, is a shelter really that beneficial versus a standalone? And the answer is going to be yes, probably across the board to any shelter that you ask. It's the cost model for us is the way our rate structure works. Obviously, we're not going to go into details of what the rate is of every shelter because we're all a little bit different, but the concept is the same. The less employees you have, the shelter might seem a little more expensive, but as you grow, the cost per hour of our rates go down to a cost that no company will be able to afford doing it themselves. That's kind of the model of the shelter, is that we will ensure that you have the most capable people ensuring the success of your company in the side of administration, at least, for whatever size, at the cost that no company can do it. No company can beat us unless you go and talk to another shelter provider. So no standalone company can really do it at the cost that we do it. So the reason as to why you want to be a standalone or want to be under a shelter are two different reasons. It's more of an internal reason as to why you would want to invest more money to go on your own. But at the end of the day, a shelter is always going to be your best option when it comes to cost. Thank you.
Thank you. No doubt. I mean, there's consensus and many years of success stories. Shelter concept always wins. Is definitely better. And you spoke about two take away here: buying power and economies of scale are important ingredients in the model that enable this lower cost, and everybody wins really. So thank you for your points of view. Salomon, the next question goes to you. It's maybe more, again, complex. There's not enough time during the seminar. We have 12 minutes to go, and we need to wrap up with the next 3 or 4 questions. We are making very good with timing. How does the shelter program minimizes risk in Mexico for the client? What is your point of view there?
Thank you, Aldo. Well, Joshua and Angel have developed the concept of the shelter and have introduced the concept of risk minimization from their practical standpoints. Let me just go back to the concept of the shelter, the typical shelter, the pure shelter, where the parent company doesn't have a subsidiary. It doesn't have a wholly owned foreign subsidiary in Mexico, a WOFI, like they call it, but they are operating under the shelter, and they're using the company that is a subsidiary of the shelter, and there's no relationship between the two other than the contractual relationship. Therefore, they are unrelated to the parent company, the entity that is operating, but they manage and control whatever happens in that shelter company. That's the beauty of no risk with total control. Now, this configuration essentially creates a shield for the shelter customer operating in Mexico under the shelter company, the pure shelter. This shield basically will be operational for all compliance and all the red tape aspects of the Mexican authorities. What more commitment you have than whatever authority is going to come to audit and check on the shelter company is going to be checking basically the operation of the shelter company, not the parent company itself, because the entity under the audit is going to be the one that belongs to the shelter company. So basically, you're totally shielded. You're shielded from the non-recurring activities of the authorities that typically involve licensing, operating permits, certification for the index program, etc. That those can be complicated, expensive, and difficult to get. The advantage for going with the shelter is that you will get all that, and you don't have to distract your technological transfer, your hiring of employees, and the startup of the operation with all this nuisance, which basically is a sum-zero equation. If you do it perfectly, you'll be able to operate. But if you do it wrong, you get all the problems and the fines, etc. So from the non-recurring licensing and operation to the day-to-day recurring nuisances of the registries, records, and audits, just imagine for every import and export, there's a pedimento. And imagine this complexity. All of us are familiar in manufacturing with the bill of materials. You have a similar concept in the customs area, where the Mexican authorities in the IMEX program, you're able to bring duty-free whatever materials you're going to require into the country. You bring in duty-free for as long as what you export balances with what you imported. The complexity here comes when you're importing raw materials and you're exporting finished goods. So there's magic, black magic here that converts the finished goods into discounting the import pedimentos of each one of the components that you imported under raw materials. So you technically have a bomb explosion to match whatever exported, whatever product you exported, and down count the components that you imported. At the end of the year, you need to balance those two. You need to make sure you balance, because if you don't balance, then you're going to be in a condition to have to permanently import things and are subject to fines and value-added tax. So it's very important what Joshua and Angel described, that all shelters need to have systems to address these, and implementing them are peculiar, different, difficult, not only just to create, but to maintain, because the red tape and the regulations that are constantly changing, unfortunately, for the country. But fortunately, you have the shelter that takes care of all that. So I hope I explained the risk containment with coming to the shelter. That's definitely the way to go. Thank you.
And you guys are experts, and this is a key critical aspect of the benefits of the shelter concept itself. So I'm sure there's lots of knowledge and experts in your organizations for that. There's one question, I'm going to give it to Angel, and this is related to the previous one. What happens, Angel, what happens if there is a mistake in customs or a transaction, for example, and the operation gets a fine or some type of questioning from authorities? What can you say?
Well, that's a very interesting question, actually. You know, as in all cases, an operation in Mexico, having the support of a shelter service provider, or even if you are not in a shelter and you have your own entity and you have a service provider, not only for international trade, but for all of the areas, it is a team effort. There is some information that the company has to provide to the service provider or the shelter provider in order for the shelter provider to be able to efficiently manage the activity to be managed, either human resources, payroll, accounting, you name it, any of the areas. We as service provider need and require several information of the operation itself that only the company is able to provide. So if we receive it properly, of course, our job and our main goal is to make sure that the company fully complies with all the regulations that the government nowadays require. Now, put in this scenario, actually, the answer is quite simple. Depending on who makes the mistake is, of course, who is responsible to pay the fine. For example, if the company fails to provide the required information to the shelter or the service provider, it would be responsible. It would be responsibility of the company. Now, one important thing to mention here is that a good service provider will always be aware of what is missing and will always inform and has to be constantly informing the company. You know what, I'm missing this information. We need the information this way in order to comply with the government regulations. So constantly delivering and providing these guidelines for the company to successfully deliver the information, it is critical. And that's actually one of the things that differentiates a good shelter service provider from a not so good shelter service provider per se. So it is very important to understand that our goal as service providers at all time is to make sure that you fully comply with all of this and make sure that you do not make these type of mistakes. And in the other hand, if by any chance it happens by any mistake, the shelter service provider is the one that made the mistake, there is an omission on the information or some inaccuracy on the information, of course, the shelter service provider will be responsible to pay this. Um, it is also important to mention and also take into consideration at the time of evaluating alternatives on shelter service providers. Most of shelter service providers have warranties on our terms and conditions of the contracts of service that we deliver to our customers. So actually, that is an important point that you might want to review at the time of analyzing the alternatives that you have to work with the provider. Uh, that's pretty much the answer. Depending on who makes a mistake is the one that is responsible.
Thank you, Angel. We are now approaching the allotted time for this seminar, for this particular webinar. I would give another minute or less, if possible, gentlemen, just to be respectful of the audience. If you want to make a final remark, I'm going to start by going with Angel, then Joshua, and Solomon for a final remark, please.
Absolutely. As Mexico along these years have developed really well and really strong strategies to operate. We are not, strangers to the foreign investments, and you can have the opportunity of successfully have a business in Mexico if you get the right support. It is not black magic to operate in Mexico, of course, to follow rules and regulations. We currently have a constant change, of course, and having the support of a specialized service provider that can become a bridge, not only operationally, but culturally to your operation and your parent country, it's really important. So at the time that you select and you decide to work with a service or shelter provider, just make sure that is the one that matches your needs and requirements. There is not right or wrong service provider. There is not anyone better than anyone. We are all different. We all offer different things, and those things that make us different are the ones that will be more efficient or not to your operation. So those are the main things that you might want to take into consideration at the time of coming in Mexico and considering having the support of a third party.
Thank you, Angel. Joshua, final remarks, please.
Thank you, Aldo. First of all, I just want to say everyone understands Murphy and his laws. He exists in Mexico too, and that's where having a shelter provider definitely helps you. I'm not saying that Murphy doesn't touch us shelters, but it's definitely nice to have a partner in Mexico with you to be able to help you through the issues and through the challenges that happen. It happens in the U.S., it happens in China, it happens all over the world. And having a partner on your half, which any of us three, I can guarantee you that we'll take care of the needs that you need here in Mexico, is definitely the most beneficial way that you can have, at least to start up. If your intentions are to go independent in the future, start up with a shelter and have the shelter help you go independent. It's definitely your way of learning and being safe and protected while you're in Mexico. Thank you for inviting me to the webinar.
Very good. Thank you, Solomon. Last but not least, your final remarks, please.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Let me end up with a little anecdote from my career. And basically, I'm much older than all of you guys. And in the 1980s, I had the fortune of working with a defense company from the US coming here to Chihuahua, Mexico from the aerospace industry. It was my first job. The company name is Westinghouse Defense and Electronic Systems Group. This is the 1980s I'm talking about. And we were making wiring harnesses for the mighty F-16 Fighting Falcon. And we were making a number of PCBs, printed circuit boards, and printed circuit assemblies for a variety of radar systems for a number of military and non-military aircraft. For those of you in the aerospace industry that are from the old guard, we were working in the MIL-Q 9858A and MIL-I 45208. Those are the old standards before the aerospace standard. And just let me tell you the advantage of the shelter. Of course, Westinghouse came in a shelter program in those days in the 1980s. And let me give you an anecdote of this that will encompass this tremendous advantage of coming into a shelter, even for a company as mighty as Westinghouse Defense Electronic Systems Group. Today is Northrop Grumman. Northrop acquired Westinghouse. And that company required, and I'm going to make reference to what we're seeing here in Zoom, free. In those days, we were doing as well software development. We were creating the compiler for a number of radar systems. And we had software development engineers coming from the Monterey Tech doing software development. This is the 1980s here in Chihuahua, in contacting with the engineers in Baltimore, Maryland. It was not manufacturing, it was software development being done remotely here in Chihuahua. And we had to put a video conferencing capability to allow for the software engineers to talk to the users and be able to design these compilers for these radar systems. And we had to go to get an authority from the Secretaría de Comunicaciones y Transportes, the SET, that had the monopoly in all communications. It was forbidden to do any type of activity. Forget telephone, video conference was out of the question. So we had to put a satellite link between Chihuahua and Baltimore. And this, of course, was the Westinghouse engineering working together with the Mexican engineering, but getting all the permitting done. This was only capable to be done through the shelter program, the know-how and the know-who. Very important to get the proper authorities to get this infrastructure in place. It was one of those huge antennas that you used to see in the movies like E.T., Phone Home. That type of antenna was the one that we put in place here in Chihuahua in those days. So shelter, definitely, my friends in the aerospace industry, is definitely the way to go. We have come a long way. There's even vocations throughout the Mexican Republic. What's happening in Chihuahua, in Querétaro, in Mexicali. So there are clusters, and we're specializing now. Some in aerostructures, some in jet engines, some in machining, wiring harnesses, all the avionics. We're making, I cannot tell the name, one of our shelter customers is here in Chihuahua, is making helicopters. We're just missing the avionics and the propellers and the turbine to install. And basically that's happening today.
That's great, Solomon. I'm looking at the list of participants here. I see the vast majority are still on, so I'm gonna give one extra minute to Joshua and Angel. If you want to share, if you have some anecdote or a quick recap of a success story that you could bring up in the last portion of this webinar. We can start with you, Joshua, if you have something in mind.
Yes, thank you. I have a client, same thing as what Salomon is saying. Due to client privacy, we don't want to mention the names of this client, but they started off here about 15 years ago. One thing that we pride ourselves on is having clients, just like every other shelter that's probably on this call too. We pride ourselves on having clients that have been with us for years. And it's one of the biggest things that we look for. I have one client that started off about 10 employees for years. They didn't get over 10 to 15 employees. And then just recently they jumped into 2 buildings, and then they went up from 10 to 50. And then now they're actually in 3 buildings spread out through the city of Nogales, Sonora. And they're in 3 buildings. They're about to be hitting over 200 employees. And their business has just skyrocketed. And it's just been fantastic. And I mean, just to go really brief, it's for them, it was their business ended up growing in the US as well, which was fantastic. So we saw that Mexico started growing, and so did the US, which is something that is just a fantastic to see. So you saw 3 facilities here in just Nogales, Sonora. And then what we started seeing in the US is that they went from California. Now they opened up an office in Arizona. Now they're opening up an office in the East Coast. To service their clients. And as they started growing, they started sending more down into Mexico. Mexico is no longer a simple skill process type of employees. We now do R&D. We now have very technical people working in the facilities. And this client specifically, similar to what Salomon was saying, they invested their money and time to get into the schools and the universities here, and we helped them and opened up the door, getting them into the universities to prepare and develop the students in the schools to give them the right type of people that they needed. They started bringing down CNC machines and then started actually developing tools and dies for those CNC machines, and they're doing it all in-house, which is something that never used to be done. So definitely the investment that we can put in to get into the schools and the universities, everybody's open here in Mexico to be able to help them develop and expand the business and get the business better and going and growing.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing. And Angel, if you have a thought of a successful case study,
Sure.
we cover and then.
Sure. Yeah, I try to make it short and sweet. Also, we're really strict with the confidentiality of the information of our customers, so we are not able to disclose names. However, I would like to tell you about a customer that we currently have actually on the Bajío area. It's been working with us for around 5 years already. On the first years of their operation in Mexico, they were actually with another service provider operating. Again, they were not a good match in terms of expectations and delivery, and they had their own individual shelter. Therefore, they decided and they looked for us to, try to find a different alternative on delivery and service. And it was relatively easy to do this transfer. This customer, once they started operating with us, still under a shelter structure, with the support of us, they managed to double their operation from around 45 to almost 95 employees, being an important actor actually on the Bajío area in terms of metal stamping and heat treatment services to the industry. And at the time, they had the need also to become independent. Again, it was relatively easy since we did just the transfer of the shelter entity to them with all the permits and registrations, as I mentioned on the previous question before. And it is important to mention that as of today, we are still supporting with the full administrative support on all of the administrative areas. So in a nutshell, the message I would like to give you everyone is that shelter is a great option to start with. You can start with a shelter, and finding the right provider that will adapt and tailor-made their service offerings to your needs. It's going to be, pretty much safe passage to a successful operation in Mexico.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Well, at this time, it's been a pleasure to share, this opportunity with our audience. I want to thank Joshua, Salomon, Angel for your time, for your insights, your sincere advice. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of opportunity from the audience to interact with you directly. I want to also thank our sponsors that made this possible, this transmission possible. To the audience, thank you very much for staying a few minutes longer than expected. I'm sure it was helpful for everybody. Thank you, Mexico Now. And at this time, we finish our transmission. Good afternoon. Thank you very much.